I am here in studio with Liam Scully. As we know, the verdicts were handed down in the Karen Reed murder trial, and Liam Scully, a criminal defense attorney and partner with the law firm Scully and Lagos, is joining us today to give his perspectives. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get started with the next phase, I just want to ask, what are your thoughts on the trial overall?
Well, it was a very compelling trial. I think the jury did a great job. It's hard to disagree from my perspective with their verdict. And, I think it's great to have closure because a third trial would have been a nightmare.
Indeed. And now we're moving on to the next phase. But something interesting that's happened in the aftermath is the special prosecutor, Hank Brennan, Alan Jackson, they've kind of been exchanging a war of words over social media, it appears. Is that common?
I would say that is highly unusual. And this, continues in the path of this case being unusual in many respects. But normally, when a criminal trial ends, the prosecutor and the defense lawyer privately and quietly shake hands and wish the other good luck along the way, and that's about it. This has spilled over into some public back and forth, which you don't usually see.
All right. Well, now we're going to move on to the civil part of the trial because that's what's coming up next. And the interesting thing is this is being filed in Plymouth County, not Norfolk County.
That's correct. And I did take a look at the filing, and the best I can tell, this lawsuit is brought by the estate of John O'Keefe, and one of the representatives of the estate happens to live in Plymouth County. So from what I can tell, that's the reason that the case was brought here, is effectively one of the parties resides in the county, even though all the action, so to speak, is in Norfolk County and elsewhere.
So in filing for a civil, you don't necessarily have to file in the county where the incident happened, it appears.
That's correct. As long as there is some connection to the one of the parties or the facts, it would normally be okay to file in any county connected to one of those things. So in this case, one of the parties to the case is from Plymouth.
Well, like I said, now we're going to be moving on to the civil portion of this case here, and just so people can understand, how is a civil trial different from a criminal trial?
A civil trial is very different from a criminal trial in many respects. So they will be in superior court. They'll have a jury of 12 ultimately likely to decide the case. But gone is the presumption of innocence that Karen Reed enjoyed. Gone is her right to remain silent, which she exercised. Gone is the requirement that the prosecutor prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, or that the judge or that the jury comes to a unanimous verdict on that decision. So instead, it's jurors of 12, but only 10 have to agree. And instead of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, they just have to find it more likely than not. So essentially a 51% chance that she was liable. And her Fifth Amendment right, which she exercised in the criminal trial, is gone. So she will, I assume, be deposed in a deposition prior to trial, and then will have to answer questions on the stand unless there's something that I don't see coming, and that's going to make a big difference in the case.
And this would be conducted in a courtroom, though, with a judge, a very similar setting.
Very similar setting. There's a lot of deposition work, which are under oath statements taken of witnesses, which would, I think, likely include Karen Reed in this case, and all the other witnesses that are taken in basically conference rooms with a stenographer. And so the trial in a civil case becomes much more scripted. People have already been questioned and cross-examined by all the sets of lawyers, and they have transcripts, and they use those as their roadmaps for the civil trial, which still can have different answers and twists and turns that weren't expected. But it's a more scripted, usually, path than a criminal trial where a lot of people have refused to talk before.
And now she's also not going to be having the same legal team, it doesn't appear.
That's correct. It looks to me, based on the review of the docket, that she has brought on some civil lawyers who specialize in that area. Not people I'm personally familiar with, but that would be typical. To bring in a civil team to defend the civil case and a criminal defense team that specializes in that for the criminal case.
It's because is it kind of just two different ways of going about it?
Especially the procedures that lead up to the trial. So the rules of civil procedure, what has to be filed and when and how, does not correlate with the rules of criminal procedure. I would say that once you're in the courtroom for the final act, so to speak, the trial, the criminal lawyers are very well suited to jump back in if they're not already in, and could be part of that. But it's typical to switch gears and have civil specialty lawyers.
And as we mentioned, the burden on the plaintiff here, not the prosecution, but the plaintiff, since it's a civil, it's not as high.
It's not as high. So instead of the prosecutor in the criminal case had to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, now the plaintiff, which is the John O'Keefe estate, has to prove the case is more likely than not, that she was more likely than not responsible for the death. And that's basically 51%. And again, not unanimously, 10 out of 12 jurors could agree, and that would still sustain their burden.
Now, is there any way to tell how long a civil trial can be? Because especially this was an unusually long criminal case, because most of them are, 3-6 weeks, something like that, for a criminal trial?
I would say your average murder case would be tried in about 3 weeks, and this one was double that, I think, the second time around, and maybe even longer the first time around. Civil cases sometimes take, just as long or longer. They don't always go full days. There are more breaks sometimes, so that can extend things. But I would think, based on what I've seen of the criminal trial, that the civil case would probably take a month to try, somewhere down the line.
Now, it's also very common for the criminal trial to come first, and then we have the civil trial. It doesn't usually go the other way around.
That's right. And the reason for that is Karen Reed was charged with the crime of murder and had a Fifth Amendment right not to testify and not to incriminate herself. She would not enjoy that right in the civil case. So it's pretty commonplace in Massachusetts when both cases are filed, which they were and pending at the same time, that the civil case gets stayed, essentially put on the back burner, so that Karen Reed is not forced to give up her Fifth Amendment right in the criminal case.
So now, when we think of a high-profile trial that had both a criminal and then later a civil trial, the one that comes to mind, especially for those of us who have lived through it, is the O.J. Simpson trial. That was probably the one that most people would remember, I would think, that followed a similar pattern.
I think you're absolutely right, and obviously those were different outcomes. Criminal trial, O.J. Simpson was acquitted. Civil trial, he was found responsible. And you never know what the outcome's going to be in this case, but the Karen Reed saga is along those same lines.
And of course, there are different cases for many, many reasons, but nonetheless, they are both high profile. Can you see any similarities that could give you a clue as to how one might go?
Well, I think the biggest similarity was how high profile it was and how much passion the public had in the case, in both cases. Because high profile can sometimes still have people be pretty neutral out there in the community. But this is a case, the Karen Reed case, where I think the communities in the South Shore anyway were really into it. It's hard to find people who don't have an opinion and know something and know why they have an opinion and feel pretty strongly about it. So I think the O.J. Simpson case was a lot like that. I was in law school when that case happened.
Now, something else I want to ask too, what we mentioned with O.J. and Karen Reed, both had extensive media coverage at the criminal trials. What could we see in terms of media coverage at the civil trial? Do you think we could see that same level? Would they even allow cameras in?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that they would allow cameras in Massachusetts. I can't recall civil cases, whether they would. I think they could allow them in. Usually there's less publicity around a civil case, but I think of maybe the Reggie Lewis case, which was a high-profile civil case involving alleged medical malpractice, and I think a lot of that was was filmed on camera, is my memory.
And how soon do you expect that this trial, the civil trial, when do you think we could see that really start to get moving?
That's a good question. So I did, review what was available in the public sphere for that, and nothing told me for sure when it would start. It wouldn't surprise me if, sometime next year, so 2026. A year from now, if they're ready to go on that. That wouldn't surprise me.
All righty. Well, we'll be keeping a watchful eye on that, and as this develops, we'll probably have you come back in and give your thoughts once again. But thank you so much for joining us.
Always happy to be here, Dan. Thank you.
And once again, we were talking with Liam Scully, a criminal defense attorney with the law firm Scully and Lagos. We're going to put this entire interview up online, and once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.